Hello, bro, welcome. Dire news, I don't have any liquid today. It's really bad. I actually have to ask Kate to bring me some. It's gonna make me really angry. It's fine. Hey, Fairby, welcome. Hey Sam, welcome. Glad you made it. This is still a bit too loud for me. Make it a bit lower. Yeah. Feeling a bit on edge myself. I've been in 6 hours of work meetings. Way past my saturation point. Alright. Sorry to hear that. That's certainly unpleasant. I guess you would rather do something productive, not just listen to someone rambling. Well, here you are, listening to someone rambling on, so I hope it's not gonna be a chore to listen to. And so I hope I have everything ready. I should, but if I really do, that remains to be seen. You'll just work with it as we go. As is usually the case with these historical specials. The last one we had was Hussites. And this is gonna be more or less next one in line in terms of, you know, interesting points in Czech history that you might not know about. And, you know, the time between Hussites and this, because you'll be starting at, like, the abolition of serfdom, which is 1790. I don't actually remember the date. I have it set up in the presentation. But between then and there, like, there was not that much interesting. There was a 30 years war thing, but I don't think we need to talk about that. Not today, certainly. I was the one leading most of the meetings, so modern people listened to me ramble, but trying to get a bunch of new people up to speed on a project is always a problem. Yeah. That sounds like a problem. Yeah, maybe being in charge is even worse. It probably is, because otherwise you can just sit there and listen, right? Well, I hope you can relax then. 6 hours is a long time to talk. Hello, Tintin, welcome. Well, I'm not educated about the Czech Legion specifically, but we are getting dangerously near the history actually. And well read on. Yes, you know. It's gonna have to start somewhere. I'm gonna have to tell you what the precursors were, because currently I need to work with whatever we had last time. And last time, what we had was Hussites. Oh, it's very loud. Yeah, so Hussites. With Hussites, we've covered a lot of things. It's just that it's very different from what people thought and how they behaved in this period. And the reasons for it are clear. Just need to cover it. Hopefully it's not gonna take absolute ages. Hey, Florian Dancer, welcome. it shouldn't take ages. I will probably go on freaking tangents, but yeah. Some of it is gonna be simplifications, of course. At the same time, sources are mostly the internet, but also some literary sources, as in people who've seen the legions do things, written journals themselves, or legionaries written journals themselves, and from that we know a bunch of stuff that has been added. It has been totally researched by Czech Military Institute, and we have our veteran association, which carefully studies every single journal that has been left behind from that point, and they even count all the numbers of them and the legionaries themselves and things like that. So it's quite serious in terms of how much we know about that. Some people devote their entire career to studying that. So we actually know quite a bit. But some of it is also from what I remember being told in school, and so some of it might not be entirely accurate. But I try to fix it by just, trying to find comparable information sources and then just seeing what adds up and excluding what doesn't. So hopefully it's gonna result in something remotely close to reality, as is always the hope. But I cannot tell you right now. You will have to tell me. Did Czech legions use flamethrowers? No, they have been invented towards the end of the war, but I doubt there was a single flamethrower on the Eastern Front and where they were fighting specifically, but I might be wrong. They might have used one. I'm afraid I'm rambling on about stuff. It's fun to hear all the knowledge. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is like useless small little things that don't really add to the big picture. But, it's... You need to remember, we are talking about Czech legions in total, in their highest numbers, were like 76,000 men. And all of them military, captured from past being Austro-Hungarian troops, and then also some ethnic Czechs living in Russia joined them. And so every single one of them had his own story, and like you can imagine that if you look at the timeline of Czech legions, you are starting somewhere being born in like 1890 and even earlier sometimes, and then this person is gonna go from a Austro-Hungarian peasant basically to then becoming a soldier, to then becoming captured by the Russians, to then fighting again against Austro-Hungarians, capturing more Czechs and then bringing them to the legion, then the whole thing through Russia, then you come back to your country, some of them through USA. Then you see the creation of your own state for the first time since medieval period. Then you have the Germans invade. Then you go and fight this new threat. You return and you get murdered by the communists. And that's basically the legionary life cycle. I mean, that's how most of them died. I also will talk a little bit about the RAF pilots in Second World War, because it's intertwined. We are not gonna stop after World War I. We are gonna talk until there are legionaries no more. Okay. Shouldn't take long, thanks to our red friends. But yes, that's how it's gonna be. Hey Frankie, welcome. Yes. The armored trains are gonna be some of the biggest things about them. It's funny how there is a correlation between Hussites and legionaries, where Hussites relied on war wagons, specifically made for that purpose, and in medieval period worked quite well against their enemies. In here, it's sort of similar, where just a niche thing that like armored trains, yeah, they were quite useful, but like no one went full armored trains. They did, and it kind of worked. So, there is a correlation there. Something that's kind of niche, and they just went ham on it, and it worked. That's what these people tend to do. It's also, they themselves saw themselves as having some examples from how Hussites operated, and implementing that into their own ranks. I'm gonna let an AI read you the oath they took as well. It should give you a little bit of an insight, but before we start with all that, we should talk a little bit about how it all started. And so I'm gonna just run some royalty-free background music in the background. I'm sure you will not mind that because I don't have choices. So let's just make it happen. I'm sorry, I should have prepared a playlist, but I coupled this together today at night. So like I don't have that ready. So it's just gonna have to be random royalty-free music. It's been pretty awful. Yeah. If I had a playlist at least. Okay, shut this off. Any minute now. And we can see what I'm talking about here. I'm gonna set this up, then I'm gonna read the chat and we'll begin, okay? Let's put this, I think we need a chat, we need this. I could make the chat smaller. Okay, I think this is alright. This is gonna be where we see all the slides. Florence says, do the Czech legions use laser guns? No, this is a serious topic, so, you know, unless it's something really relevant, I know it's half funny, but like, I'm not talking about nonsense. There, you can ask whatever you want. If I know an answer to anything, I'm gonna tell you. But this is obviously like, you know, it's not the regular. This is the historical special. So take it a little bit more seriously. If not, then just don't comment on it. You can criticize anything, that's fine. But like going on and asking about absolute nonsense is just gonna delay me, and that's not what I want. So just asking for patience today. There's a lot of people preferring Russia over Austrians. People really did vote with their feet. Well, it's more complicated than that. But with Russians, it is sort of a double-edged sword. You will see why it happened like that. It's not that simple. Like, people like to see things as just a single, simple solution and answer to everything, but it actually isn't. And you will see in practice why. Because the Russia tends to implode, and when Russia imploded in this time of history, well, the Czechoslovak legions didn't really stick around for much longer. They didn't want to be in Russia. They didn't feel like Russians, and they just wanted to go home. But there was this whole bloody war in the way. So how to do that? Well, you're gonna have to go through all the freaking Russia, which is massive. So that was fun. Okay, what does Lottington say? Russia also loved its armored trains through both wars. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to talk about it a little bit more seriously. Cannot have like absolute nonsense, right? At least that's the idea. So, welcome. Today we'll be talking about the birth of Czechoslovakian state and the Czechoslovakian legions. But before we cover all that, first I need to actually show you how the Czechoslovak state, or rather the idea of it, came to being. Last time we covered the Hussite Wars. In the Hussite Wars, Bohemia was still independent kingdom, or independent. It was part of Holy Roman Empire, but it had its autonomy as any other state within the Holy Roman Empire. And so you cannot really think of it as being like completely independent, but it's also not a subject, as in terms of, you know, not being able to have your own laws and language and things like that. While in medieval times, there was more of a problem with nationality, where people were not aware of, they didn't identify as Czechs a lot of the time, because you had lots of people speaking different languages, from Polish to Silesian to German, and a lot of these, they know what kind of king they have, but overall it was not as simple as in terms of modern nation state, and that is because before abolition of serfdom, people just didn't think along those lines yet. But they shared a common language, usually, they shared a common culture, and they shared usually a monarch and things like that. But you also had regional lords and nobility. So it's more complicated than I want to get into, but suffice to say, last time we talked about the Hussites, today we move on through the Hussites. What happened after the Hussites? Well, more or less after is when the Czech state was subjugated. And so when that happened was the battle at White Mountain, which happened at 1620. And their Austrian forces, mostly composed of mercenaries, defeated Czech and Moravian armies in this battle, and then afterwards the whole Bohemia and Moravia, as well as some other parts of Silesia, were subjugated and added to the Austrian Habsburg holdings. These holdings more or less remained until 1918. There were some other wars before World War I happening, even through Bohemia, and namely you had the Austro-Prussian War. We could talk about it at some point, but not today. It's not that important. So, Slovaks are more complicated because they didn't have their own state until after World War One, and their own state as being part of, Czechoslovakia. It's Czechs and Slovaks, so that's how it was. And Slovakians didn't have their own nation before this. They did identify as a separate group, but most of their history they were under the control of the Hungarians. Okay, and even to this day they don't have exactly great relations, and so that's how that is. More than one war between Prussia and the Austrians, only Napoleon could make them allies. Yep, I mean, you are not wrong. It's just the major one, the one that actually made an empire out of Germany later was the Franco-Prussian War, but before we had Franco-Prussian War, we had Austro-Prussian War. And that's when it all started, and that's why I mention it, because it's more interesting than the small little wars before. It's one of the bigger ones, even though it was very quick. Regardless, so this map will show you, if you look at it, ethnic composition of Austro-Hungarian Empire. All the colored areas are part of Austro-Hungarian Empire at this time, and so you see that you have like a shit ton of different culture groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It had lots of its issues tied directly to that. As for example, it was impossible for the Austrians to collect taxes and recruit in Hungary unless the local nobles agreed to do that. And a lot of the time they just said no. And there is nothing the emperor could do. You see the red is German, so, ethnicity with Austria is more or less, I guess it's not completely accurate. If we had someone from Austria today, they could probably tell us that this is simplification. It is. But more or less it will make sense. So you see also some northern Italy, there was a lot of war between Austrians and Italians as well. And then Bohemians lived, you see Sudetenland already was kind of settled with Germans at this time. Oh, kind of, a lot. You've got loads of Bohemians living in like central Bohemia, and then more or less, if you look at it, you should see reasonably sized like nation states later from these groups that you look on when the Austro-Hungarian Empire gets broken up. But Croatia is like more Yugoslavia, which means like shit ton of different small little states in the Balkans, so this is probably a simplification as well. But it should give you an idea. So Slovakia was part of Hungary until 1918 and never was an independent state before. Okay, pretty simple. So let's just move on to the next slide. National revival. So German was the only language for all the official business. So that's going for the period from 1620, when the Czechs were defeated at the Battle of White Mountain, up until this point we are talking about, which in this case is going to be 1781, where serfdom was abolished. So German was the only language for all official business. National movements were suppressed. In 1781, after serfdom was abolished, people started to gain national consciousness. Rural folk usually kept speaking Czech since Middle Ages. Yeah, so in cities you had more of a society that really conformed with the idea of being part of Austria-Hungary, and even if people were ethnic Czechs, they would often speak German, and everyone knew some German to an extent because it was necessary. Anything and everything you needed to do officially needed to be done in German. That's how it was. Okay. Now, why did the emperor give us abolition of serfdom? Well, this is before the French Revolution. Like it's the same sort of period. People were just, there were reform movements that demanded liberal constitutions and things like that from every monarch. Austro-Hungarian empire was not the exception. And not only that, but problem was at this point, even you had sort of that start to pre-industrialization, where the government really needed to entice people to move into cities to become workers. And even at this point, it was kind of apparent that there needs to be this move. And in order to do that, you kind of needed to abolish serfdom because people are no longer tied to their lords in terms of where they live and what they do. Okay? And so with serfdom, it was basically impossible to industrialize. So that's why they abolished it. And it was more for this reason rather than, we want to be nice to someone. No, of course they were aware that it's going to bring up a whole host of other issues. Namely, it's going to slowly make nationalism rise amongst the small little states that are composing Austro-Hungarian Empire. But I guess didn't have much of a choice, especially since, French Revolution happened and all the good and all the bad that went with it. They just didn't want to face a revolution of their own. So, better do some concessions as a monarch rather than wait and suffer the full brunt of it. So, that's gonna be this. Nothing much else to talk about. So slowly people start to gain national consciousness after this point, and as we go on, this is 1000 Czech crowns banknote, by the way. I'm just showing this because of the person on it. Need for direction. Czech and Slovak intelligentsia starts to gather and put together language and history of their people, some from folklore and rural dialects. Slowly people start to identify as separate from the Austrian regime leading up to World War I. Yes, so this is one of the prominent Czech revivalists. He's called František Palacký, and he's a big figure. He's got like a bunch of monuments in Prague. Very important person for Czech state and nationality. And so he was not alone. There were a bunch of them. Austrians were cracking down on it, of course. Something to say. Yeah, so this led to some controversy. Some people were trying. It happens with every nation. When you look at even ancient people, like what did the Romans do when they needed to interact with other peoples, like Greeks or Carthaginians, past Phoenicians? They looked at their history and went like, man, I wish we had a history like this. And so what they did was the Romans invented their myth of Aeneas, that they came from Troy when it was destroyed by the Greeks, right? Czechs kind of did a similar thing where they looked at all the surrounding lands, like Germans and French and everyone else in Europe, and went like, we also have a history, but much of it is lost because we were enslaved for 200 years, so we remember basically nothing. The language is done and everything, so they needed to put it together. And in some cases, they made some mistakes trying to do it because there was no institute facilitating this. This was all kind of on their own, and so they did manage to do it, but some of them did some mistakes, as I said. Slowly people start to identify separate from Austrian regime. So again, this would make it so that the regime cracks down on any movement that they find out about, usually, and they really didn't want this. But there was nothing they could do because it was prevalent and there are many people involved with it, and so eventually it's just not attacked as much as it was when it was founded. So let's move on. So World War I breaks out. In 1914, Serbia is to be annexed by Austria-Hungary, but Serb nationalists assassinate an heir to the throne in Sarajevo. So that was in Serbia. You can see a map right here. Can you even see my mouse? Probably I cannot. Well, there's a map down there. You can see where stuff is. I wish you saw my mouse. Oh no, you can't see it, right? Can you? It's just very small. Yeah. So we've got the assassination itself. This is just a painting of it. So there were groups like with the Czech revival movement, but some of them much more violent. And this is one of the cases. The Serb nationalist movement was actually like, they're freaking terrorists. They prepared bombs, they shot people, they even were prepared to just, kill as many civilians as necessary to achieve their goals. So there was a big difference if you are willing to use violence as part of your agenda or not. These kind of movements, and they did. They managed to assassinate an heir to Austro-Hungarian throne, which sparked this war where Austria went to war against Serbia. But if we read on, so Triple Entente, the Allies, and Triple Alliance, the Central Powers, go to war with each other. So Europe was kind of preparing up to this point already. There was a big arms race going on. Countries had their beef with each other for a long time. Germans wanted to invade French again because French crumbled last time they did it. So, there was this sort of thing going on. You also can see on the map there's no Poland. At this time there was no Poland. It was divided amongst the German Empire and Russia. But Polish people still existed, and they sort of were in a very similar situation as Czechs, where they're basically a subjugated nation without a proper nation state or representation or anything. So, it was all leading up to this. Something, what I want to talk about. Yes, so the reason Russia joined this war, also you can see that Italy was originally as part of the Central Powers. This is incorrect. Italy is gonna join the Allies, or the Entente. So Russia joins the Allies under pretense to protect other Slavic nations against Germans and Austrians. Yes, so Russia basically says, Austro-Hungarians are expanding again, and they are gonna get even more Slavs under control, and they are gonna be very mean to them. But, spoiler alert, Russia, the freaking bear sitting on your doorstep, is already eaten a bunch of your neighbors, and they don't treat them well when they do that. So, it's one overlord over the other. I wouldn't see necessarily that big of a difference. It's not like the Austro-Hungarians or Austrians were really purging any of the Slavic groups. They were just suppressing their national movements. So there's a difference. But Russia would do the same thing. They didn't encourage separatism. So it's all about not losing face and things like that. And so it's a pretense. I cannot in good faith tell you otherwise, because if I told you, the Russians wanted to help their Slavic brothers, no, and we even weren't Slavic in terms of DNA anymore anyway, because people are living here for such a long time that currently it's 20-30%. So all of it is misguided. Just cannot really tell you that. Yeah, I mean, it's just not. It was not. It's just an argument for them to be able to get another puppet going. Okay, that's what they wanted. It's basically that's what was going on. They also trusted themselves with their military, and they thought that there's gonna be a giant war, so it's not gonna be that difficult to invade Germany, right? Yeah. Next. State of the army. So Franz Joseph, which was an emperor of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Panslavism, yeah, but not really. You need to realize that if it was truly that, then it could have maybe had a chance of success, but problem with that is it's unrealistic. Problem being, do you know what happens on the Balkans? People claim descendants from bunch of different things, and then the country implodes every time something minor happens. Yeah, I mean, it's even as a justification is just, it's thinly veiled. Like, they needed to go to war, so they went with this excuse, even though they did guarantee their independence. Basically, like, if you played Hearts of Iron 4, they guaranteed independence of Serbia, and then Austro-Hungarians went ahead and tried to do a coup, or they wanted to peacefully overtake Serbia, but they couldn't. So they went with the military option after they got their air shot. But the deal is, Russians were trying to put themselves in this position of a suzerain that would, as you say, unite all and protect all their Slavic friends in Europe. But in fact, no, it was just the bear being hungry again and looking at another neighbor. Oh, who could have guessed? So shocking, right? Yeah. I mean, many people here kind of listened to it at the time. Reason being, they were, subjugated nation, and they just identified with Czechs from medieval age. So the national revivalists have told them, and now they saw Russia and went like, oh, that's the biggest Slavic state, right? And so we should see them as friends. And yeah, to an extent, but not really, because again, it's the bear. Like, it's not your friend. If you try to drink with the bear, he's gonna eat you. But the KGB also so good at propaganda. Well, there were several. Well, I don't know if you're talking about Okranka or if you are talking about Austro-Hungarian secret police, because there were secret police on all sides, and they were all awful to their own people. But like, who was the most awful? I cannot tell you. Probably the Russians, but Russia was full of very, very, very rough people at this time, and you needed rough solutions to keep rough people in order. And so I'm not justifying it, I'm just saying that if the event would work here, it wouldn't work there, because the people would just not listen to just being told, you shouldn't do this or we are gonna arrest your family. No, most of the time in Russia you needed a bigger stick. Try to weaken others by inciting Slavic nationalist movements. Yeah, that as well, because it suited their agenda. But same as Germans did that to Russia, where they created Lenin and then went, oh, wouldn't it be fun if Russia implodes? Let's send him in. Yeah. Like, pointing fingers doesn't really solve anything. Everyone has their share of garbage on their plate. I'm just saying, generally speaking, how it was. So hopefully I'm not stepping on too many toes here. Okay, so we've read about that. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So that was the state of the army. Franz Josef, the Emperor of Austro-Hungarian Empire, declares mobilization, and Austria-Hungary fields approximately 9 million soldiers, mostly conscripts, of which 1.1 million will never return home. So you can see they have some early cars with them, like for logistics and other military purposes. This is one of them. It's loaded with guys, but yeah, it looks pretty bad. Like this looks like, a lot of these things were just made by carpenters or something. It doesn't look like something from a factory, even though the very first car made in Austro-Hungarian Empire was actually made in Bohemia, because Bohemia actually had quite a decent industrial base. It was actually quite industrialized for its area. So 1.1 million will never return home. 1.4 million of these soldiers are Czechs and Slovaks. 140,000 of them are estimated killed at the end of the war. So you've got like 10% overall casualties, like dead, but also like almost everyone was wounded to an extent in some way or the other. So like casualty amount in modern terms would be much higher, because today we estimate casualty as also being either prisoner of war or wounded, but yeah. It was a lot. That's just, I'm telling you this because you need to realize how many people were conscripted by the Austrians. They needed the Bohemians. They often recruited a lot in Bohemia because they needed it, and it was like a big part of their empire, which again, good industrial base, lots of peasants, lots of people, not that hard to control because we weren't rowdy, so they just used it. It was always their breadbasket, industrial base, and conscription center, because If you went ahead and tried to say, hey, Hungarians, I need 1.4 million soldiers, the Hungarians would not do that. Hungarians would say how much, and they would consider doing it. So yeah. Austrian army suffers from poor logistics and leadership, which has a burden of favoritism. Doctrine is also outdated. So yes, favoritism, the thing that everyone loves with monarchies. So what happens with favoritism? We know it since, look back on how Roman Republic died, which had its issues. I'm not a Republican, but the empire had its own issues as well. Problem is, with empires, is that the first emperor might actually have good intentions or not be such a horrible person, but as it goes on, it technicality, if you think about it, empire should be stable because every emperor will have the best fate of his people and the state in mind in order for him to further his own agenda and his descendants to do that, right? But in practice, what happens with empires is that empires will appoint useless people to important positions because he's my cousin or whatever. That's what happened. And they also forbid triumphs, things like that. They don't want to appoint anyone on merit. They want to do it entirely through favoritism. If they do that, then what happens to your armed forces and to your general government is that people who are incompetent but highly born will be occupying positions of power like this, which leads to incompetence. And it led to huge incompetence in the Austro-Hungarian army. That's why there were so many defeats, because people were poorly led, poorly equipped, and overall there was a lot of them, but it didn't really matter. Especially since, imagine you are fighting Russians on the Eastern Front, you're not fighting on the Western Front, there are no extensive trench fortifications and immovable lines. In Eastern Front, land usually changed its hands quite quickly, because even cavalry had lots of uses, but every time, we're going to talk about it in the next slide. Let's go for it. So, the Eastern Front. So, Russia suffers defeats against Germans in modern-day Poland, but does well against the Austrian armies. So, whenever they fight the Germans, the Russians just absolutely crumble and lose half of their total armies in that area to absolute desertion. It's just so many POWs taken by the Germans. It's insane. You read about some of the battles, it's unbelievable. But when they fight the Austrians, even so weakened, they still kick their ass. And so, that's how it is. Austrians suffer many casualties and POWs from poorly organized offensive operations. So mostly offensive operations, also some poorly managed defenses, but suffice to say, when their operations backfire, a lot of the times the Russians take prisoners. And they also do it with cavalry. They use Cossacks, light cavalry, to really chase down and, take any prisoners they can. Fun fact, during the First World War, in this manner, there was actually other national groups as well from Austro-Hungarian Empire, like frickin' Tito, the future dictator of Yugoslavia, was in this war, and not only in this war, but he was actually in the same way, captured in the same way, where he was lanced by Cossack lance and then captured. Helena, you're welcome. And so that's what happened to Tito as well. So many people's fates kind of intertwine in this. So just generally talking about this. So Austrians suffer many casualties, POWs from poorly organized offensive operations. POWs are treated with mistrust by the Russians, but they eventually allow formation of Czechoslovak legions under an oath to the Tsar. So yes, when the Russians capture so many Austro-Hungarians, they take a look at it and say, there are lots of Bohemians here, so what are we gonna do? Jo, hodina dějepisu. Historický speciál, takže začnou bavíme o něčem jako husiti a takový. Hey Alex, welcome. And so they look at their POW camps and they say, oh, there's a shit ton of Bohemians. So since this whole war is kind of in the pretense of protecting Slavs, even though it's absolutely, just a justification, just needed a casus belli, it's not really about that, but they see practical uses of it because they needed soldiers, they were losing badly against the Germans, and Russia had its own issues at this point. Russia refused to reform, and they did have a constitution and things like that, but it was nowhere near liberal enough as people might have wanted at the time. And so what happened with that is there was already trouble brewing in Russia, and Tsar kind of got his ass handed to him before with the Russo-Japanese War. If you read about that, you know that the Russian Navy got absolutely got by the Japanese, which was the first victory of a minor power that's not European against a major player like Russia. And so that was insane. And after that, the Russian prestige took a big hit. And not only that, but people were very upset with the Tsar and with the regime in general, because again, it didn't really provide people with what they wanted, which was more liberties. And so instead, people just, they sucked it up, because at that point the movements weren't strong enough to do anything about it. But as World War I goes on, there are more and more losses, people are more upset, and so these movements grow stronger. And so one of these movements is going to be the freaking Bolsheviks. The people, the Germans created Lenin, and they not created, but it's just they offered him a safe haven, and then they sent him into Russia by hopes of destabilizing Russia even more, which proved to be very effective. So they did that. But where are we? Yeah, so they've allowed the formation of the Czechoslovak legions, but under an oath to the Tsar. And so they needed to swear an oath that's gonna be about protecting Russian interests and the Tsar himself. And so that's usually an oath that soldiers would take at the time. You swear an oath to the sovereign, not to nation, because nation states were not really that much of a thing at this point, at least in most of the world. Okay. And so that's why they did that. Russians just went ahead and we kind of need soldiers, and so we've got loads of these guys. So we'll just allow for them to form their own legions. But specifically, the difference is they allowed them to promote on merit. So all the generals and people in charge were actually voted in meritocratically by their own men, not by appointing someone who just is a noble but knows absolutely nothing about military, as it was with Austro-Hungarian army. So legionary ethos. So they swear a new oath of loyalty to each other as... Oh, no, sorry, this is later. This is once the Russia implodes. So let me just find that, because Russia will implode. You got a bunch of stuff to go through. Yeah, right. Eastern Front. Let's go to... Yeah, so when I need to talk about when the Czechoslovak legions start to form. Again, in their highest numbers, they will be up to 76,000 men in total. That's their highest point. And at the same time, people from Bohemia will start to form an exile government that will want to take over once the war is over and Austro-Hungary crumbles. Okay, and so one of these people was Tomáš Garrigue-Masaryk, which was eventually the first president of this republic, and we're gonna talk about him, but not just yet. I just need to organize my slides because I've done something wrong. Let me just fix it. I need to shut this off for a moment. So for that. Okay, I think I found it. So, state of the legions. The ranks will swell up to 76,000 troops, being formed into their own separate armies with its own command structure based on merit. Legionaries are made to swear an oath to protect and serve the Russian Tsar, to eventually liberate their own country from the Austrians. Russians still treat them with mistrust and allocate them minimal equipment. Yes, so the Russians do allow them to form their units, and they do assign them their own operations, like, help us take this city or something like that. But what they do is look sick. Well, this is just I use fucking Paint and OpenOffice, so it is sick, but not in a good way. Right, what was I talking about? Yeah, equipment. So they gave them tactical objectives and strategic objectives, like help us take this city, things like that. But what happened was then they went like, what, we don't actually trust these guys. So what I'm gonna do is we're just gonna give them like minimal equipment. Like if you've seen the meme movie that is Enemy at the Gates, where the Russians during the Second World War go like every third guy gets a rifle and everyone else gets a couple of bullets, which is a stretch. In this case, it was even worse, and it was because they didn't trust them, so they just kind of went ahead and, you know, melee weapons, yes. So there are Austrians dug in trench systems around the city, and they have machine guns and a bunch of infantry and rifles. What you get, Czechoslovaks, is there's a bunch of agricultural tools and just go ham, you know, take whatever you want. And so they did. To the Russians' shock, they actually very quickly captured a lot of equipment, including machine guns. And so suddenly they kind of had to start trusting them, because it was, you know, it was very hard to pry away anything from the Czechoslovak hands when they got it, because they weren't given it by the Russians, but once they captured the equipment, they were very reluctant to give it up. And so taking it would be difficult, to say the least. And so instead they say, oh yes, you are so successful, we love you guys, you just helped us massively, which they did, arguably. But more than that, it was also that it was starting to form a relationship where they were a little bit afraid of them, because it was now suddenly a force of up to 76,000 troops, trained soldiers, which were in Russia, and it's made up a political power as well, because they could have done different things. So, you know, that's how it is. So let's move on. So at this, as I talked about, at the same time as this happens, you have the exile government basically starting to form, even though Bohemia was not at this point, or before World War I, independent state. Just before, you know, since the Battle of White Mountain at 1620, we were enslaved by the Austrians, basically subjugated nation, and so there wasn't a government to go back to, but they started to form in exile in Russia. And so some of this was done to be encouraged by the Russians, as we talked about, because they wanted to erode the systems of empire in Europe, and this was a tool for them to do that. But a lot of the people here were already thinking about it before, just didn't have the power to do it, and war opened up new doors and new options for them. So that's kind of how it happened. I'm gonna show you a slide that's gonna have legionary flags and a Czech flag. As they were making the nation basically on paper in Russia, they needed to design a flag, and so, you know, we know which one was adopted eventually. You've got different people suggesting different designs. You can see a freaking Hussite chalice here. It was a little bit extreme maybe, but yeah, I mean, you see where it comes from, right? And where it starts is white and red, which you might think Poland with this, but these were actually the customary colors of Bohemian Kingdom during the medieval period, so that's why it's like that. So yeah, eventually it was settled on this design. I think this one, sorry. So yeah, they designed this and then they optimized it. And next up, this is a flag of Czechoslovak legions. And so what they have is the Bohemian lion, the Slovakian cross, the Moravian eagle, and Silesian eagle. So these are the insignia of all the different, or coat of arms of all the different parts of Czechoslovakia. And there's also some other parts, but let's not talk about that. It's too complicated. And these are the actual banners from museums, and so you see how they looked like. This is what they made by themselves in Russia, these flags. Okay, so these were the actual battle standards they were using, and so you see the iconography is quite clear what was being said here. and we also have the Hussite chalice. And I'm gonna let an AI read you the oath of the legionaries eventually. I don't know which slide would be the best for that, but for now we are still in an area that they still serve and swear an oath to the Tsar, not to themselves, or Czechoslovakia for that matter. They want to liberate it, but they at this point serve Russia officially because the Russians are allowing them to, not be prisoners of war, but rather become soldiers again. What museum are they host? I think we have a specific place for it. I cannot really tell you. I might try to find it. It's an interesting question. Let's take a look. Now there is a veteran organization that is called Československá obec legionářská, which is a veteran association of Czech veterans, and it includes people and even people affiliated or they're like family members of the legionaries, and so they actually have their own places, and I think they hold the insignia. Plus, you actually have, this is a key part of. I want to show you this at the end, at the very end, and there's a reason for it. So I'm gonna eventually show you a thing that's done here, and that is the military people still kind of worship this idea of Hussites and also the legionaries, right? And so it's when our president is doing something, he has his own castle guard. And these people are stylized according to these legionaries as well. Plus, they actually have, each time we got, I'm gonna tell you this, I told you this before, when you swear an oath to law enforcement or military here, the music that's played is played with live bands that is performed by their special bands from the army, and then you've got music that's specifically made as Hussite chorus, and that's from the song we heard when we talked about the Hussites. That's what they use even to this day. And insignia with Czech military is actually, you've got different things that look like Hussite or legionary stuff, and so there's still a very strong association even to this day. Even though I'm gonna talk later about what actually happened to these guys, because that's something that's awful. Canadian Legion here, it sounds similar. Yeah, I mean, for sure, you had expeditionary forces in Europe a lot of the time, same as Anzacs and other guys from Commonwealth lived and died a lot, especially in freaking Turkey. So they definitely deserve their own people to also keep them in mind a lot. It's just that with the legions, it's a little bit more complicated because our state didn't exist. So they helped found it by, fighting the Central Powers, because 76,000 men is not little, especially when they had lots of combat experience and they were pretty effective. Out of the 76,000, only 4,000 died at the end of the whole Russian thing, even after they went to freaking Vladivostok. 4,000 of them, which is very sad, were left buried in the Russian steppe. Yes, but 4,000 out of 76,000 is not that much considering. So, could have been worse. Let's move on to men in the legions. So you can see a uniform here on the left. So they had summer, winter uniforms. You are in Russia, you need a winter uniform, and you need it to be good or you die. So yeah, it looked like this. You've got photo, you can see a lot of the guys would be wounded a lot of the time. Like, again, casualties was a liberal term with these, because you've got again, 4,000 died, but like almost everyone got wounded at some point during this whole thing, and so it's kind of hard to estimate, but yeah, just a lot of guys wounded all the time. That's just how it was. And so you see they kept their machine guns with them all the time because they're very fond of these things. They also, again, captured anything they could as equipment and very reluctant to give it away. Since the Russians allowed them their own organization, this is Heliodor Pika, one of the key legionary figures, general, very strong authoritative figure. Of course, later murdered by the communists. Who else? And so yeah, that's how they organized. So let's move on to under second eagle. So first eagle was Austro-Hungarian eagle. Then you've got the second one, which is the Russian one, and then eventually there's going to be a third one, and the third eagle is the Reich eagle. So, so many eagles. And this is all the scope of one person's life. We are talking about like these events happening in succession where they lived through all of it. So, something to think about later. So even with minimal equipment, legionaries proved to have exceptional morale and swiftly capture large amounts of military material, including machine guns and armored trains. Battles where legions were deployed generally went well for the Russians, and they gradually gave them more credit. Each battle yielded more POWs to recruit, so they swelled as they conquered more and they won battles. They just got even more recruits because people wanted to join them, because they were captured from the Austro-Hungarian army, and they saw how ineffective it was, and that they known about the revolt movement, so they joined up quite willingly. A lot of them did, not just because you can leave the POW camp, but also because they actually cared. So if you didn't, then you didn't really stick around. This is actually paintings of the Battle of Zborov, which was one of the main battles of the legionaries, and these were the guys who were legionaries before it was cool, and that was when, there was no like wide recognition. The Russians were still only giving them very minimal equipment, and Battle of Zborov happened was where the Czechs were part of the main army facing the Austro-Hungarians, and they won quite well. They didn't lose many men at all, even though they faced a lot of artillery, things like that. Just again interesting, like there's just stories. If you read the accounts, is that the Russians have given us agricultural tools. We've got some, harvesting knives, things like that, axes, and they have to storm machine gun nests. And they sometimes do it with deception or at night time, things like that, to capture more equipment and then fight with that. Because they had to improvise. If they just rushed out at the enemy in the open plain, you can imagine how that would go if the enemy was set up in position. So yeah. Trains. These are how the armored trains look like at the time. Used by a lot of people. Very useful things. These. There's also something to be said about the legionary pilots. They actually had several planes, but they didn't have any machine guns or bombs on them. They just used them as recon aircraft and some small arms fire from it, so like a rifle. They wouldn't even have a machine gun. So yeah, these are the trains, and the trains were a core thing for the legionaries, and we'll explain why. They had basically a city on the tracks, because like the legionaries had several train columns going through Russia when they wanted to escape later. And so what happens with the trains is you have a train that one wagon is a mess, one would be a barracks, one would be a fighting wagon with a freaking howitzer in it. Imagine trying to fire a fucking howitzer out of a running train that has a passenger car which the howitzer is put into. I would not want to fire that howitzer, and I think neither would you if you fired it before, because it would not be good. But they did it, and they also kept machine guns in these. Yeah, you can see pretty thick walls with wood just to armor it. If there was no iron, you would armor it with wood. Just thick walls of wood. They also, in Russia, there was a lot of ethnic Bohemians and Slovaks living there. Not like a whole bunch, but enough so that more recruits would be gathered as well from these people who identified as Czechs or Slovaks, and they would join up with the legions. Other civilians, people who were ethnic Czechs or Slovaks wanted to go to Czechoslovakia after the war is over. So even women and children were sometimes with Czechoslovak legions along as they tried to go to Russia. But we're not there yet. I'm just showing you the trains. but I need to talk about some of these things so that you are not completely lost when we start talking about when shit goes down, it goes down quickly, okay? So, yeah. I think train would just get blasted by artillery. Yeah, you would think that, but the thing is that you need to realize what happened in Russia was a complete implosion of a political and military system. And so what happened was they capitalized on the Russians, doing Russian things and fighting each other, while they had the time to just push through the major cities, at least some of them, and not get blockaded by that big of a force. But yes, these armored trains actually, they resisted artillery fire, at least most of them. Of course, if you got hit in here, you would well die, but like these thick steel plates, that would resist most of the artillery, especially since, it depends on the artillery in question. Like if you deploy a siege gun and the train is not moving, it's probably pretty easy to destroy it. But if the train is moving, it's not that easy to hit it, especially if you are a Russian conscript who never, saw a gun before. And that's what, arguably during the Civil War, a lot of the people were just like not very experienced troops because it's the Civil War. And so the whites are fighting the reds, and amongst this chaos, the Czechs are coming through. And yeah, the trains were effective. They didn't lose many of them, and at the end of the war, they captured 259 total trains like this. And they made workshops from some wagons and things like that. They did their own metallurgy along the tracks. Like it's, as I say, it's quite interesting to see. There's actually a thing that's called Legioblock, which is a museum on tracks in Czech Republic or Czechia. And what happens is there is a train that's built exactly according to the knowledge we have about these trains, and it's a museum on tracks basically. So yeah, that's what it is. They also have their own artillery, and so if you had your own artillery, there's a good chance of counter battery fire as well. So it was not as simple as you might think. But yes, setting up ambushes for sure happened, and I'm gonna talk about that. But apparently it didn't kill many. So that's interesting. I would also think that fortifying a train station and putting like several artillery pieces overlooking where the train will have to come to a stop would pretty much eliminate them. But so if you are running a defense of a city like that, even say you have the artillery to do that, what happens is you start shooting the train, and then usually this train would be loaded with guys, and you know that these dudes have gone through, overtaking machine gun trenches with freaking agricultural tools that you've given them. Now they have proper guns, and they are very mad that you shot them. What's gonna happen when they just disembark? Isn't it better for you if you just let them go? Because that's what the Russians did a lot of the time. They didn't want to fight them. Because why would you? They were some of the most experienced troops that were on the Eastern Front. So, are you insane? Do you want to lose everyone? What is gonna happen is you will die. A lot of other people will die. It's just better to let them go. But the Bolsheviks really didn't like the legionaries. They wanted to stop them and murder them, send them to Siberia to the precursor to the Gulag system. But they didn't catch many, even though they sent orders to different Bolshevik leaders in different cities to not let them through. They had to settle on just taking each time the legionaries would stop in a city, because they needed to, because of a railroad junction, they would need to surrender part of their guns. But they didn't ask for too many as to force a conflict, but they would just ask for just enough so that they went yeah, fine, we don't want to fight, we just want to go home, so just take these bloody guns and just let us go. And so they did that, and then eventually it came to a head. I'm gonna tell you when. Where are we? Here. Yeah, so Russia implodes. So Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, future president of Czechoslovakia, organizes exile government to oppose the Austrians and helps to provide legitimacy to the legions, which boosts their ranks, because obviously people want to know that they are fighting for something that actually is legit and not just, a private army or whatever you would call it. At the same time, Russian Tsar takes direct responsibility for the war effort and is blamed for defeats. Russia is engulfed by revolution. Legionaries and Bolsheviks see each other as enemies. Yes. So the White Russians are more understanding. They usually try to entice them. They go like, yeah, we know you hate the Bolsheviks hate you. Just come fight with us. We can change this. And when Russia implodes, the legionaries could have pretty much done whatever they wanted. 76,000 organized men into an army. They could have went to Moscow or St. Petersburg and just, take charge of the situation, but they didn't. They decided to go home, but they couldn't go through the regular way. And I'm gonna show you what they did. So, legionary ethos. So, when Russia implodes, they swear a new oath of loyalty to each other as brothers in arms and the future Czechoslovakian state. They wish for democratic system based on nationalistic values and seek inspiration from history, namely Hussite movement and organization. Other smaller legions form in France and other countries. And what I'm gonna do now is, let's let an AI read you the text of their oath, just so you have an idea. So this is direct translation. There might be some, inaccuracies. Let's hope it's good enough.
We, the soldiers of the Revolutionary Army, formed far from the borders of our homeland, always break the bonds that bound us to the Habsburg Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We remember the grievances that have not been avenged for centuries, and before our dear nation, now represented by the Czechoslovak National Council, we submit this oath ceremony. In the name of our national honor, in the name of everything that is most sacred to us as people and as Czechs and Slovaks, we swear that we will fight alongside our allies against all our enemies until our Czech and Slovak lands merge into a separate and the independent Czechoslovak state. Until our nation in our lands is the complete master of its own destinies. As loyal warriors, carrying in our blood the heritage of our glorious history and always mindful of the unforgettable heroic deeds of our national martyrs and our Hussite warlords, we promise to be worthy of them, to obey the orders of our chiefs, to honor our banners and insignia. To never and for any reason ask the enemy for mercy, do not beg for circumstances, and do not surrender with a weapon in your hand, brother, to love and protect brother in danger. Do not be afraid of death, and lay down everything, even your life, for the freedom of the nation and the homeland. Without any coercion, freely decided, so we will act according to this oath.
Okay, so we got that. So that's their oath. This the text of it that we it got preserved, obviously, some of the important stuff. But yeah, this is what they swore as an oath, and then they formed up and started moving to Russia. They held a democratic vote and decided to go home. They didn't want to fight anymore because the Russia imploded, and then Bolsheviks also ended the war. I think I have it on the next slide. Legions choose direction, yes. So soon after the revolution happens, Russia splits into white and red factions that fight a civil war, while Russian participation in World War I eventually ends with a separate peace. So even if they wanted to keep fighting the Austro-Hungarians, they couldn't. One, logistics, there's a civil war, everything's on fire. But second thing is, Russians will just opt out of the war, and just you couldn't stay there. So they couldn't go home this way, which would be the simplest thing, because there's Warsaw, there's Prague somewhere over here. But you couldn't do that because of this. So instead, you need to go to the east. Legionaries debate what to do next, and they see their oath to Tsar as void since he is no longer in charge. They decide with a democratic vote to go and return to their homeland. The way west was blocked through, though, so they had to go to the east. Yes, so some of the very basic stuff. Let's move on to life on the track. So this is inside of the train. This is pictures from the Legiovlak museum I talked about before. So yeah, like imagine firing this fucking howitzer out of a moving train. I would not want to fire that howitzer, I can tell you right now. And if I fired it once, I certainly wouldn't want to fire it again, because I would know what it does, and it's nothing good. You can bet on that. Same with this. Imagine all this smoke from all the gunfire with the machine guns going in. It would be pretty unhealthy environment, I must say, to be in there. But yeah, this is one of their garrison wagons, the one which would have the machine guns and the firing slits everywhere. You can see barracks cots, I think, very simplistic. Again, they need to have like a sort of a city on tracks with this. So post office, commanders, wagon. You got different, of course, army center things, but also workshops and things like that, because they need to make a lot of things by themselves, like, you know, hammer out new things as parts for different weapons and the trains themselves and things like that. They even had to get a wagon full of timber and iron as spare tracks and just build up tracks wherever they went. And there was like a sabotage, someone detonated tracks so that they cannot pass, so they need to repair it. That's what happened quite often. So yeah, that's how it was. And so yeah, let's move on to the long journey. So legions embarked on Russian train tracks to Russia, initially heading towards Arkhangelsk, but later Vladivostok, due to the civil war was raging all around them. So Arkhangelsk is somewhere over here. You see the arrows going like that. Well, that is Prague. That is where they were initially, somewhere over here. They need to go all the way here, and then some of them went to the US and then go to Europe, or some of them went through Mediterranean, you know, different parts, probably to Italy or Yugoslavia. But yeah, so like it's insane how long it took, and when they arrived home, the war was over. But we will talk about that in a bit. So the long journey, legions apart from the trains, yeah. As they went, they initially avoided combat, trying to stay on their own side. But that's usually requisitioned. I wrote this at night, so sorry for any mistakes. Requisitioned. Is this correct? Properly. Part of their weaponry for letting them pass controlled cities. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. So they needed to pass a railway junction, and so they would go to a city, and then the Reds would be, who were in control of the city, would say, give us a part of your guns and we'll let you through. It's a policy, we need to do that. So as part of the disarmament after the war is over, right? And so the Czechs kind of went ahead with it over the time. Even though they hated anyone touching their guns, they did it because they wanted to avoid fighting. They didn't like it when they had to kill Russians, but they would if they were forced to. And so this went on for a little bit until Chelyabinsk happened. And Chelyabinsk is one of the cities in Russia. And what happened in Chelyabinsk is the legionaries would arrive with their trains and disembark on the station. Yeah, no problem, Alex. See you around. Bye. So in Chelyabinsk, the legionaries would arrive with their trains, and again, the Reds are in control of the city, and the legionaries disembark from the trains, and they want to bargain with them so they don't have to give up as much material, right? And they at this point kind of knew what to expect, and they knew that the Reds were trying to disarm them so that they could then destroy them later. So what happened next is one of the Russians, it's actually probably funny that that dude who did this was most likely, I think, Czech as well, or Slovak, I don't know. But it's known that he was with the Russians, and so what happened was he threw something, I think it was a bayonet or a rock, things like that, and he threw that at the disembarking legionaries, severely wounding one. And when this happened, there was some, shouting, and then the legionaries shot him for this. And when they shot him, the Russians apprehended the group that did it, and around the guy who shot, and then put them in prison and wanted to send them to Siberia. So when this happened, the rest of the legionaries were very upset that they had to give up some of their weapons already before, and they knew where this was heading, and they saw what the Reds were doing to their own people, and they hated that, and the Reds hated them for obvious reasons as well. And so they said, okay, that's it, we had enough. We are not gonna cooperate with this corrupt government. There's no rule of law anymore. This is just completely made up. We just defended ourselves. Let's take our weapons and just bust out these guys from prison. And so they did. They just went ahead and just, got their guys. And they did manage to do that. And after that, they just left Chelyabinsk. And from this point on, they would go and just, if there was a confrontation with the Reds, they just shoot them. No questions asked. You had accounts of two trains passing each other, one full of Russians, the other one Czechoslovak legions, and they would just exchange small arms fire as the trains were coming past each other. Things like that happened on fairly regular basis. So yeah, nothing great. No one liked that, but they were kind of forced to do it, I suppose. But there are some morally grey things I'm gonna talk about as well. So yeah, moral grey. After Chelyabinsk, the legions fought through any opposition if they could not negotiate reasonable terms. White factions usually tried to persuade them to join the civil war on their side, but Reds fought with them. There are incidents where passing trains exchange gunfire, rail blocks need to be removed and rails repaired. Civilians often join the legions as well to live with them and try to escape Russia. Yes, we are talking about ethnic Czechs and Slovaks who lived in Russia at that time. There were quite a few, and they traveled with them with the trains as a city on the move, as it were. A lot of these people then came back with the legionaries back to Czechoslovakia. In Kazan, legionaries requisitioned part of the Russian gold treasury and reserves. $32 million worth of gold eventually arrived with them to Czechoslovakia. Yeah, so they stole part of the Russian treasury and gold reserves. Again, moral grey. You can argue that 76,000 troops fought and died on the Eastern Front for the Russians, and they were never paid, and they were never given anything than, very shitty equipment. So, maybe they were owed something, but they're most likely not owed this. But in their mind, I think the justification was, we don't want this to fall into the communist hands, so we just take it because Russia is on fire and the communists will get this if we leave it here. So just took it. White Russian commander Kolchak falls into their hands along the way, and they decide to eventually give him up to moderate authorities in order to buy passage forwards. He is later executed by the Reds. So Kolchak was an admiral, a dude that maybe I can show you. Well, no. So you can find, if you search for Kolchak, it's gonna show you. So he was an admiral before the war, and when the war erupted, he was part of the White Russian force, and this Kolchak dude actually resigned command, but then the Whites were really interested in getting him back because he could actually be a unifying force, and so they could use him to make it so that the White Russians actually have not a bunch of separate warlords, but have some figure to tie them together, and then maybe win against the Reds. But the legionaries got their hands on him, and they took him with them. And then eventually they came to a railhead where there was a really dangerous position where the Reds would surround the rail station with a lot of guns, like artillery, and they would say, give us, or it was not Reds, it was moderates, but affiliated government to Reds. So they would say, give us Kolchak and we'll let you go. And they debated this a lot, but it's morally grey because then they eventually decided that, it's one of him and it's 76,000 of us, and we just need to get through. And so as much as we don't want to just let someone get murdered, we're just gonna give him up. And part of the reason was because the local authorities were saying, okay, we are not Red, we are just moderates, we are gonna just take him, he's gonna get fair trial, he's not gonna get executed, and you can just go, and it's gonna be off your mind, and it's gonna be done, right? Well, turns out Red's shown up a little bit later, and we're, oh well, what do we have here? This dude we are looking for a long time, well, come here. And they just shot him. Yeah, that's what they did. So, would you choose differently in their position? Because a lot of people could have died instead of one dude. Arguably, this one dude could have made a difference in the Russian Civil War as well. I have no idea. But it's what they did. Great train robbery. I always thought that trains got robbed and not the robbers came with trains. Yeah. I mean, that's, flipping the concept on its head. But as I said, it's like with the Hussites where Hussites revolutionized medieval warfare with the war wagons and firearms, and the legionaries did it with the armored trains. Because at World War I standards in Russia, specifically, armored trains were the perfect thing to have because it just dealt with everything so well. And there was the Trans-Siberian Railway going all the way to Vladivostok. So, if you need to travel to Russia, you better do it this way. But they also had issues. They suffered from frostbite. They had to fight a lot of the time, and we are gonna get to some of the other parts as well, where as you get more east, there are less cities, so less supply, but also the local warlords will try to use you against each other and as power mechanic, basically, you know. So yeah, so that's the Mortal Grey stuff. And is inside. As legions get further east, local warlord groups use them to solve local issues in order to buy passage or try to attack them to steal their equipment. Frequent ambushes happen along the tracks. So ambushes in terms of tracks got blown up, tracks got blocked with trees. You know, you just go through a forest and suddenly gunfire starts to happen on the train randomly. Things like that, things of that nature. And so they need to constantly defend themselves and play local power politics with the warlords. In order to get through, they need to cooperate with some of them, but it's delaying them. They don't want to do it because they see it as despotic to, you know, uphold and his warlord locally, but they need to survive, and so they do what they must. But there's a lot of fighting, again, a lot of frostbite, things like that, horrible supply, East Russia, Far East. Eventually they end up with 259 captured trains, and out of 76,000, 4,000 are left dead, buried in Russia. After they reach Vladivostok near Japan, Allied ships bring them to Europe, but a lot of them also travel to USA and then back to Europe. Okay, so we are getting to the end of their Russian journey, and as I promised, we are not gonna stop there, so we'll keep going. So this is the ships, they carried them. And the long journey, we already had that. I'm just gonna, yeah, the map. That's what I wanted to show you, but and inside, and then home at last. Upon their return, they found Czechoslovakia as a republic under a liberal democratic system. People see them as heroes, having helped to defeat Central Powers. Border conflicts with Poland and Hungary are resolved militarily. Sure. Yeah, border conflicts with Poland and Hungary are resolved militarily, but thanks to the experienced army, Czechoslovakia doesn't lose much territory. Some were disappointed by issues democracy has, so I couldn't really fit more text here, but it's more complicated than that. So they wanted to have a liberal democracy when they came back to the country, and they found it. But they found it with all its issues that we currently have with our own systems, and they said like, yeah, some of it really sucks. So some of them were disappointed, but some of them liked it, and definitely better than Austro-Hungarian Empire before for them, because their entire identity was as Czechs and Slovaks, and so they got that. So already much better than what it was before, just that, you know, there are always issues. Oh, Kate saved me. She brought me liquid. Right. So I'm gonna just quickly refill. Any questions? I would be happy to answer them now, probably. Oh, yeah. Sorry for that. Hey, Frontum, welcome. Because I moved this. There we go. Thanks. It was all warped. Talk to us a bit in Slovak. I cannot speak Slovak. I can only speak Czech. I cannot do it willingly, but like if I talk to Slovak, I will understand him and he will understand me. But I cannot actually speak Slovak. That's a bit hard for me to do. Because I've only been in there once in Slovakia, and I don't know that many Slovaks myself, so unfortunately don't speak Slovakian. But I understand it. It's kind of odd when you think about it, but that's how these languages are. Okay. So you see, when they arrived, they had marches and things like that. It would be disappointing, it would. Okay, let's take a look. Under a third eagle. So those who are still in condition to fight and not too old go into exile during the Second World War and fight against Axis powers. Joined by volunteer Royal Air forces of more than 2,500 pilots from Czechoslovakia. Reason is Munich Agreement signed off Czechoslovakia to Germany without a fight, and it actually had substantial air force and an army, and so a lot of these people used this to go abroad and fight against the Germans with the British and French and other nations during the Second World War. So those who were still not too old did that. I'm also putting pilots in this so that we don't have to talk about them separately because it's very similar. And so you can see a breakdown here. So out of 2,500 pilots, you've got 531 casualties, and then you've got 365 destroyed enemy planes, six rockets, the V rockets, and then these are the aces. So 20, 17, and 15 kills on these guys. Usually an ace would be much more effective than some of the other guys. I can actually show you this. These are the airmen's insignia. They kept. Let's put the Spitfire somewhere. These, right? So you see, they still kept their Hussite sort of idea behind a lot of those insignia. And yes, they use British Spitfires, so they work with RAF, so it makes sense. No, let me just find this. They're disappointed by Munich Agreement, where France and Britain signs them off without help, but try to resist occupation. Those who have not left are interrogated, and some are sent to death camps by the Nazis. Yes, a lot of the old ones who came back from Russia and just were not in a condition to fight, or were old and didn't leave to exile to fight against the Axis, were interrogated. The Nazis didn't trust them, obviously, and then they liquidated a lot of them as well in the death camps. But stuff's not gonna get much better from this point on. So fate of heroes. After the Second World War ends, world is divided in East and West spheres of influence, and Allies allow Czechoslovakia to fall under the Red Terror. In 1948, communists falsify referendum vote and impose one-party red state upon Czechoslovakia. Royal Air Force pilots and legionaries that have returned are forbidden to leave. They are interned, interrogated, and beaten to death in prisons. Systematically, mind you, not just isolated incidents, systematically. Others are sent to do hard manual labor for life, with sentences being handed out for fictional crimes, manufactured with show trials and confessions extracted with violence and torture. Many do not survive the horrible conditions. They were often sent to mine uranium. No, it's not known how many, thereby. At least I couldn't find the figure. So memories remain. After Velvet Revolution in 1989, they received proper honors by the new state. Czech memory is forever stained by the horrible ingratitude and murder that the communist monsters committed upon these brave men who brought Czech state into existence. Regardless, they remain a national symbol of defiance and bravery, forever to be remembered with a bitter aftertaste of their ultimate fates. Last legionary was this dude. He died in 2003. So, you know, some of them made it really far, but most of them died a disgraceful death and being murdered by their own people. Because communism is a monstrous ideology that killed the most people on this planet. So, yeah, just to note that, you know, this is not an exception, and if you look at the numbers, most of them actually were killed by these monsters. So I'm gonna just show you as an end, so it's not too sad. We actually get what, yeah, if I can get to show you my internet. As I said, the final ceremony, the one that's done to this day, and just so you know that there is a respect for this, it's just that, as I said, the bitter aftertaste of this is still there. Like, that's one of the key things that we know, that what happened to our veterans from Second World War is just unimaginable. Do we have this? Yep. Is this gonna be good enough? I can crop it some more, maybe. And then make it slightly larger. This should suffice. This is the Hussite chorus. This is what plays when you swear oath as part of law enforcement or military to this day. I use it. And this is from 1 year ago. Hey, well, welcome. Yeah, but we've managed to get all the way through World War I up until now. Because I'm covering... I started during abolition of serfdom in 1781. So we ended up in, you know, I just want to sum up as much as possible so I don't have to touch upon these individual things. Did they return or were they sent back by the Allies? They returned. They wanted to go home. They had families here. Very few stayed abroad, but some of them did in US and Britain. But most of them went back. And this is Vladislavský sál, which is a part of Prague Castle, which actually holds most of government ceremonies. And so usually you would have similar things like this when there is a unit that swears an oath to the state, be it law enforcement or military. You would have similar proceedings to go with it, just so you know. But yeah, that's gonna be it. That's what I have ready. If you want this presentation, I'm gonna make it available in Discord, so you can just breeze through it if you want. It should give you the points. Of course, I went on some tangents, talked about different things. If you have any questions, now would be the best time to answer it before we end. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of time to get your thoughts together. If there are no questions, then I'm gonna just call the stream. This was a historical one. We didn't have one in a while, but I think I enjoyed it. I hope it was at least a little bit entertaining, maybe even informative. Of course, verify anything said here. You know, as always, there could be a bias. I'm Czech, so what I was told at school and things like that could be different to what is publicly available. But I try to do research. I try to give you as much of an accurate representation as possible. No, I wasn't part of the army. I was part of law enforcement for 10 years. It was a fun stream? Okay, good to know that. Thanks, Ibrahima. I'm thankful for that. I try, but you know, it's also not very conducive to Twitch. Like you see, this took an hour and 33 minutes, but the prep work is much more if I just sit here and play a random game. But it is much more important, I feel like. And also since like not many people know about these things we talk about a lot of the time, because covering the mainstream stuff is just, yeah, I mean, everyone knows about the obvious things. Not so much about this. A lot of people don't know about this. And also, since I'm Czech, I could maybe bring you something that's not thought about usually too much. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I mean, it's more niche, for sure. Because in the grand scheme of things, 76,000 troops would not be like a tremendous game changer in terms of like Western Front, where millions of men died in the offensives. But Eastern Front is different. But some of these dudes, like, they were freaking built different. As I told you, like, a lot of them were wounded. They just got through it, recovered on the freaking train. A lot of the fights with the small-scale skirmishes with the Russians in Siberia and when they were going through the Russian east, it must have been horrible. And things they went through. Again, they fought against the Axis in Second World War as well, and that was also like at that point these dudes were not the youngest. It's just interesting if you think about that one dude who was part of this Czechoslovak army. Like, he was born as a freaking Austro-Hungarian peasant and ended up this dude, this last one, right? So he died in 2003, like seeing the modern state came to be. It's just interesting how much turmoil one person in their life has seen. This is insane. Like 5 different regimes, you know, all the different monstrous ideologies. Oh yeah, there is a new game about Czech legions. Correct. I haven't played it yet. So yeah, that's gonna be it. Thank you for watching. I'm gonna send you off on a raid to see someone else. What is that game called? I can find it if you want, but I have no idea. The Train Home, right? Yeah. I just know there's a new Legionnaire game, but I haven't played it myself yet. Let's raid FG's again. He's playing Demon Souls. Yeah, no problem. Glad that I had so many viewers today. I think it topped at like 17 or something. Really appreciate it. So again, hope it was informative and hope to see you again some other time. Bye.